And hello, everybody, and welcome to Theory Play. I'm really excited today to introduce you all to a philosophy professor at University of New Mexico, Dr. Iain Thomson. Welcome.
Thank you. Glad
also,
to be.
Also to my friend Bert. Bert, thank you for the venue for putting this up. I needed fast Wi-Fi.
I'm like the older guy hanging out with the high school kids, but I have a car and an ID.
So, he bought me beer earlier.
We call that Socrates.
Yeah, actually, Bert and I go back a few years here because we've been reading philosophy in the Boise area for a few years now, and we read Hegel last year. We read some Sloterdijk together, and we like to get lunch and talk about philosophy. But he's more the Hegelian, and I've spent a lot more time with Heidegger, which is how I got introduced to Dr. Iain Thomson's work. Dr. Iain Thomson teaches classes on existentialism, introductions to philosophy, modern political philosophy, and other stuff, including entire courses on the work of Heidegger, Levinas, Derrida, or other kind of issues in continental philosophy, including death, technology, and nihilism. I'm kind of riffing off of your description off of your website here, but I actually had it was really cool. My friend Dawson wanted to go to University of New Mexico last fall, and so we road tripped there together, and it was just perfect. We got to see Dr. Thomson give a lecture to the philosophy department, and it was exciting to see a healthy department, or at least what appears to be one, where everyone showed up. The room was packed, and he gave a presentation basically reading the first chapter of a book you're working on. So, yeah, and that's kind of what inspired this. Inevitably, if I talk about Heidegger, if I reference any concepts or ideas or insights posited by Heidegger, inevitably someone's going to bring up, oh, but he was a Nazi. And so that's a great point to bring up, because it opens a really important discussion. And that's kind of what inspired you, I think, to work on this book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Well, sure. One story that I've told for a long time is that in 10th grade, when I was, it was one of my first introductions to philosophy. I was reading the so-called founding fathers of America, Jefferson, Madison, Hamilton, etc. And I was dating my first love, who was a young black woman, and reading Jefferson, who was writing about freedom so beautifully that it would make me cry. And then I discovered that he had slaves, and my 10th grade brain was traumatized by that contradiction between this guy who could write so movingly about freedom and yet seem not to be living it, putting it into practice in his own life. But I couldn't work through it at the time. And so I sort of had the same experience again with Heidegger, because when I got to Berkeley, where I went to my undergrad, I took Bert Dreyfus's Later Heidegger course first. The way he usually does it is you take early Heidegger and then later Heidegger, but I took later Heidegger first. And I loved later Heidegger. It really spoke to me. I thought it was beautiful and insightful, etc. And then when I took the early Heidegger course, that's where he tells you in the first week that, of course, Heidegger was a Nazi. But I didn't learn that until after I discovered that experience that Emerson describes as reading someone and feeling like they've articulated your own thoughts better than you could, and having your thoughts come back to you with alienated majesty. It's this kind of powerful experience. And so I spent the next 15 years trying to work through that and figure out what it was about Heidegger that led him to become a Nazi. And was his philosophy connected to it? Was it solely something that came from his idiosyncratic personality and not his philosophy, etc.? And that was the genesis of a big part of my first book, which is it's called Heidegger on Ontotheology, Technology and the Politics of Education. And it looks at Heidegger's actual program that he tried to put into practice when he became the first Nazi rector at the University of Freiburg in 1933, and where that project came from and what happened to it philosophically. And what I show is that project goes all the way back to the very beginning of his philosophical awakening in 1909. his attempt to understand what being means and what the unified sense of being is. This book that was given to him by his this guy Konrad Kreutzer, who was he became the Archbishop of Freiburg, but he was the headmaster of Heidegger's Catholic boarding school, who recognized this great philosophical mind in the young students and gave him the book and said, you know, I studied philosophy too. Here's the one nut I could never crack. Maybe you can, young Martin. And he gave him this book it's Brentano's book on the manifold senses of being in Aristotle. And in that book, it raises the question, what do all these different senses of to be have in common? And that's the question that Heidegger is still trying to answer in his famous book, 1927's Being and Time, where he's trying to give us a fundamental ontology or an understanding of the meaning of being in general. And if he could tell us what the meaning of being in general is, then he would tell us what all the different senses of being have in common. So he would have finally answered that question. And as I show in detail in that book, he linked his political project to that goal. So he thought if he could unify what being meant and show us this unified understanding of what being meant, he'd be able to reunify all the different academic disciplines in the university and thereby restore a kind of order to the university, which he'd already recognized had become fragmented. And it's something that Clark Kerr, the famous president at Berkeley, called the postmodern polyversity, where there's no uni anymore. There's no unity to the university. If you go to another department, you pretty soon realize you're speaking different languages and have different concerns and standards. And there's very little conversation about what's the unified picture of reality that's emerging from all these different angles on being that we're studying as a university. So Heidegger was attempting to answer that question, restore the unity of the university, and he believed, because of these complicated views he had about what it meant to be German, where to be German meant to keep alive the ancient heritage of the Greeks and the philosophical question about being, he thought he was restoring the unity to what it meant to be German. So he thought he was going to tell Germans what it meant to be German and answer the question of German identity, solve the question of the unity of the university, etc. But as I show in that book, and I've showed in a lot of pieces since, the attempt in Being and Time to deliver a fundamental ontology failed. The book broke off halfway through. He couldn't explain what the meaning of being in general was. He never could write the second piece. This is a somewhat controversial interpretation. There's people who think he somehow pulled it off, but I've never heard any of them explain what it is that he pulled off. They'll say something like temporality, but that's not actually the kind of answer that he needed to achieve the goals he was trying to achieve. So it's a complicated story, but the short answer is his philosophy is directly connected to his politics. What he did as a Nazi, he did specifically because of long-standing political beliefs, and philosophical beliefs, and the failure of those philosophical beliefs altered his later political views. So I think he learned important lessons from being a Nazi. There's some there's some very bad sides to it, especially stuff that's come out more recently in the Black Notebooks, etc. about, well, we can get into that if you want, but his own anti-Semitism. But typically the interventions he made as a leader of the university didn't have anything to do with anti-Semitism. In fact, his public interventions were 99% arguing against any kind of what he called crude biologism. That is basically a eugenic neo-Darwinian view of human beings that tries to reduce them to their genetic capacities, functions, etc., which was the program that comes in part out of Darwin, in part out of Nietzsche's unpublished notebooks published by his sister after he died, The Will to Power, where Nietzsche calls for this master race that will take over Darwinian evolution deliberately and sculpt human beings the way artists sculpt clay, and sees the Germans as the ones who are going to do this and become the masters of the earth. And Nietzsche had the good sense not to publish any of this, I think, and it's very controversial what his own stance on that stuff was, but it was published as his master work. Certainly some of the architects of the Nazi genocide were influenced by that view, and Heidegger is very explicit in his criticisms of that kind of understanding. When a big Nazi leader comes to the school and gives a talk in favor of this, Heidegger gives a rant to the class the next day about how this is pathetic, superficial, juvenile understanding of what Nazism means. His famous comments about the inner truth and greatness of National Socialism are about leading National Socialism away from this eugenic view of what it means to be German toward basically a Heideggerian understanding of what it means to be German, which is, in the end, it means something like to be the bearers of the question of being, those people who keep that question alive. But in in 33, 34, it means something like to be the ones who recognize this answer to that question that I'm going to deliver, which, he puts an immense amount of pressure on himself, can't deliver. That's kind of the crack up of that program. And, at the same time, he's got some specific goals he's trying to accomplish. He's trying to take over a kind of a school which will train future teachers of the German university, and the Nazis aren't interested in letting him do that. So he tried, as Karl Jaspers said at the time, to become the Führer of the Führer. That is, the leader of the leader. He saw himself as something like the spiritual grand vizier who was going to provide the spiritual vision of where Nazism was going to go, and thereby lead this juvenile and plebeian movement into a kind of deeper philosophical self-understanding. And of course, that was a megalomaniacal delusion. Hitler never had any interest in Heidegger. He had Hitler thought that Hitler himself was a great philosopher. He didn't think he needed anyone else to tell him what the meaning of Nazism was. So it was all, as the party functionary said after the rectoral address, Heidegger's got his own private National Socialism. It's not what Nazism meant to everybody else. And, there's painful intersections, unfortunately, but he, I think, subsequently recognized and knew that he'd forever tarnished his reputation by linking it to Nazism. And he writes movingly and interestingly about that in the early 40s in his work on Antigone. I've been talking for a while. I feel like I should let you get in.
Oh yeah, that's a really good, I think, that lays the basis for the next question. So if I had only just heard you say what you just said maybe 4 years ago, I might not have ever tried reading Being in Time. Or after maybe trying for an hour, I would have never tried again. And so
why?
Well, because there's a lot of great philosophers and great texts, and time energy is limited, and so that I would think, well, rather than spend a lot of time reading a Nazi, I will just choose to read someone else. But instead, I didn't hear any of what you just said. In fact, I was talking to a professor who at the time, kind of our conversations always came back to, you just need to read Heidegger. And, he made Being in Time out to be this groundbreaking moment in the history of philosophy. And so that was really my motivation. And this was a kind of professor who argues, that Heidegger was not a political thinker. He was doing existentialism and phenomenology. This is fundamental ontology. This is not the political doesn't matter here, which I know that you kind of addressed, but there's this kind of dichotomy between those who think that it doesn't matter and those who think that you have to read everything he does through that lens. And so where do you stand on that? And the other part of that question, where you stand on that changed over time?
Well, that's a hard question because I can't remember a time when I ever thought it didn't matter. But I also never thought that it was the end of the conversation. So, I mean, we live in a time right now when it's a pressing issue to think about what do we make of great thinkers, creators, artists who seem to be terrible people, right? This is like every week we discover that some person who we admire for something or other turns out to be a complete and total bastard. So what do we do? I mean, one response is we never read, look at, listen to anything they've ever done before. Again, I mean, but what if we love what they did? What if, it's our favorite artist or filmmaker or musician? Can we just dismiss it as politically tainted? I think it's a little too superficial. And I think, like, yes, there's lots of other great thinkers to read, but if you go learn about any of them, the odds are about 85, 95% that they're a bastard. I mean, it's a slightly cynical view, but the truth is, like, Aristotle was 10 times the bastard Heidegger is. You know, he was, this guy like led the armies back into his hometown that had like killed his mother. You know, it's like, but nobody cares anymore because he was Aristotle. So of course we're going to read him. You know.
So according to Oliver Thorne from Philosophy Tube, Immanuel Kant thought that black people are born white and they turn black over the first few months or what, and all of this crazy stuff. Yeah.
Well, it's like all philosophers, with very few exceptions, are racists, sexists, etc., anti-Semites. You know, it's like they're to a large degree the product of their time. And you could say, but they're philosophers. They should somehow escape the gravity of their time and articulate these universal truths that aren't bound by time and place. But in the existential tradition, that view of philosophy, that it somehow aims for these universal truths outside space and time, is rejected, right? The existential tradition believes that all philosophy is the product of concrete existing individuals engaged in situations where they have particular interests. And that's inevitable. Then there's no escaping that. So my view is, in part, it was influenced by my teacher, Jacques Derrida, who used to say, the good conscience isn't. The good conscience isn't. And I would, you know, what do you mean by that? It means it is, the good conscience is neither good nor a conscience. So are we good technologically?
Yes, yes.
Okay. And I think this in part comes out of Nietzsche's Zarathustra, where Nietzsche begins near the beginning of Zarathustra by talking about the preachers of virtue, who want to teach you to have a pure conscience, who are basically trying to teach you to be able to have a sleep without dreams. So the goal of the pure conscience is not to be haunted by, you know, all the bad things you said and did that day, but to be able to have a perfectly clear conscience. He's like, Nietzsche says, taken to its extreme, that's like a dreamless sleep. The goal of life is a dreamless sleep. Well, what's a dreamless sleep? Death. So they're basically nihilists who are teaching us that the goal of life is death. And in fact, as long as you're alive, you're going to be guilty. That's another, Heidegger says that basically in Being in Time. It's in Kafka, right? It's this idea that there's no purity. There's no, there's no righteous purity where you're somehow free of all taint and can, feel like you've got a monopoly on truth, or you're 100% on the side of the good and the righteous. It just doesn't happen in life. So part of, I think, coming to terms with Heidegger, with Nietzsche, with Foucault, with Derrida, with all these, to me, great thinkers who nevertheless did or said terrible things at times, is coming to terms with our fallible finitude, our human predilections for errors, the fact that we screw up. We're not born like that paradoxical personification of wisdom, Minerva or Athena, fully grown, fully armored as like a perfect truth ready to be defended. We learn through making mistakes for the most part. That's how we learn. We get better if we're lucky and we're thoughtful. We improve. We learn from our mistakes. And each generation tries to be a little better than the last generation. But guess what? The next generation is still going to come along, and the things that the most righteous thought that they were doing that were perfectly fine are going to look horrendous and horrifying in the eyes of the future generations. And that's a good thing. That's part of progress. That stuff that looked completely innocuous and normal and what everybody does or everybody thinks is something that we now need to be much more critical about, think about, and move beyond. So I'm a little sad to see when young people think, oh, if Locke, I heard a talk recently about what a bastard Locke was. If Locke was a bastard, then I don't have to read him. Well, if you don't read Locke and Hobbes, you're not going to understand Jefferson, and then you're not going to understand America, right? You're not. So it's like the idea that you could somehow, if you didn't have to read anybody who was politically tainted, your reading list would be very, very short. In fact, I couldn't put anything on it myself.
It's good. Yeah. Sorry, I was just reading one of the audience questions is, what are your thoughts on Marx? And I feel like that might be way off. I don't know. Conservatives have definitely told me he was a bastard. I don't know.
About Karl Marx the guy, or about Marx the philosopher?
Oh, that's a great question.
I don't really have any views about Marx the guy. I don't know very much about his life. Somebody told me I looked like him.
You need a bushier beard, you know.
I don't know where they were coming from.
So let's for the people who are watching this now or in the future, who are new to Heidegger as a name, or at least they know nothing maybe more beyond the name or the association that we've been talking about so far, what would you say some of his achievements or relevancy still today are for you?
That's a great question. So, I mean, even though Being in Time is a book that, if it was a student's paper, you'd have to give it a bad grade because it fails to deliver on its thesis statement. The thesis statement is, I'm going to answer the question of being. I'm going to tell you what being means. I'm going to deliver a fundamental ontology, which he defines as an understanding of the meaning of being in general. And he never does it. So you'd say, well, you failed to deliver on the thing you said you were going to deliver. So, you know, I don't know what grade you give that, but the fascinating thing is that despite that failure, this is the most influential book of the 20th century. So why? What was so amazing, inspiring, insightful about Being in Time that it launched, you know, 1,000 other philosophical ships? And the short answer is there's two things. There's two divisions of the book, the so-called pragmatic division, as my teacher Dreyfus used to call it, and then the existential division too. And it's not quite that neat of a division, but that's a nice simple way to think of it. Division one makes a very powerful argument against modernity. It basically shows that the fundamental axiom of modernity, the subject-object dichotomy, the idea that there's just a radical ontological split or fissure between the self and the world, is a mistake, from which follows most of the obsessions of modern philosophy with skepticism, etc. And that rather than dedicating our efforts to trying to finally answer the skeptic, we should put them into real issues. And that's a pseudo problem, a false problem that comes from a mischaracterization of the human being that doesn't get to what it's actually like to be us. Heidegger's argument there, why it's called pragmatic, is pragmata is like tools. And most of the time, we're not like Descartes sitting there staring at a piece of wax and asking, what can I know with absolute certitude? We are instead riding bikes, driving cars, reading books, writing with pens, etc. And in those experiences, there's not a split between us and the things of the world. They're integral parts of our self-understanding. When I'm writing with chalk on a board, you know, I'm not thinking, I am a teacher writing words on a board to explain Heidegger. It's just this self-understanding at work in what I'm doing. And Heidegger called that a being in the world, or a Dasein. It's a self-world interaction that does occasionally come apart. But if you know, when my chalk breaks and I can't find chalk, and I sit there saying, look, how am I supposed to be a teacher when I have no chalk to write on the board to explain this point to you? Can you follow this without me writing it on the board? Then my self-understanding is broken down for a minute. Same thing can happen when you're riding your bike and the chain breaks and you can't fix it. It's no longer this part of your lived world getting you to where you're going. It's now this tool that's not functioning. But the Cartesian subject-object divide begins with the broken object and then tries to build the world of the bike rider out of the broken parts, and you can't get it. Whereas you can quite easily get the broken bicycle by starting with the view of us as equipment users skillfully intertwined with the things of our world. So that's division one. It undermines Cartesian dualism, so it's the most profound challenge to modernity, because subject-object dualism is the fundamental axiom of modernity. the whole fact-value dichotomy that follows from subject-object dualism. That to get to the Marx question, Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, all of them buy into the fact-value dichotomy because they all are modern thinkers who believe in some version of the subject-object dichotomy. That is the view, basically, that value comes from human subjects projecting or investing through labor, in that case, the world of inherently valueless objects with value. Heidegger's view is that's a disastrous misunderstanding of meaning or mattering, that in fact, once you realize that humans are part of their world, you can see that things matter independent of us, and that it's not up to us completely to decide what matters and what doesn't. That what really matters is invaluable. It's not something you will commodify in exchange for the right amount of money. So that's division one. Division two is where Heidegger gets into the questions of guilt, death, basically the existential topics, and that launches another, another series of thinkers who develop those thoughts further. And then later Heidegger, who gives up the project of fundamental ontology in a kind of radical existential death, that is a world collapse where the self-understanding of the guy who's going to, since 1909, was going to tell us what the meaning of being in general is, that guy realizes he can't answer that question the way he wanted to, and that the answer to the question, what is being, is not some specific thing that you can use to divvy up all the different academic disciplines and tell them what to study, but it's something like an inexhaustible plenitude that can never be finally conceptualized and known. And that it's something we have to stay open to in an attitude of questioning, to do what he stops calling philosophy and starts calling thinking.
Right. And so there's this movement, some people call it the turn, right, from Heidegger, the thinker of meaning, to the thinker of thinking, away from philosophy and towards thought.
That's right. And what I've been arguing since at least my dissertation, which of course nobody reads, but that's last century, in my book in 2005, is that the sine qua non of the turn, or the difference, the fundamental difference between early and later Heidegger, is the later Heidegger's understanding of that there's a difference between the being of entities, which is what Being in Time is talking about, and being as such. Being as such is what makes possible, and yet is never exhausted by, all the different historical understandings of the being of entities. So that later view that being is not something that we can finally know and give some definition of, but rather it's something we have to remain vigilantly open toward in order to continually draw forth meaningful words, names, poetic insights, artworks, etc. from it. That's the later Heidegger. And it's a minor controversy in the Heidegger scholarship about whether to call that the turn or not. For a long time, people did, and then there was a reaction against it at the beginning of the century, and people got, there's a Heideggerian Das Mann that just sort of follows whatever everybody else is saying, and tries to say, oh, well, there's no connection between the turn, which is something that happens to being, and the change between earlier and later Heidegger, this kind of obvious stylistic transformation from a philosopher writing in propositional form to someone who deliberately takes up a more poetic, open, polysemic style. But that's false. There's a direct connection. You see it. It's one of the things you learn in the Black Notebooks. If you aren't only searching for horrible things he says, is he specifically decides he's going to write in a more poetic way in order to try and do justice to this polysemic nature of being as such, the way it holds itself open to multiple meanings. He thinks that's something that poetry does better than propositions, because if you say a propositional assertion, that wall behind you is white, well, it is or it isn't, but if that's a line in a poem, the white wall whited wallingly or whatever, right? And then I say, well, what does that mean? Does it mean A, B, C, D, or E, all the above? The answer, if it's a great line, which that wasn't, would be E, all the above and more. That's what poetry does. It says multiple things at once. That's what makes it great. It holds itself open to being read in new ways. And that's why Heidegger thinks poetry is a more fit tool for getting us in tune with the nature of being in its polysemic, multiple meaningedness than a propositional assertion which tries to render things with a kind of monosemic exactitude, a binary on or off, up or down. It's awesome or it sucks. It's a Nazi or it's great logic, the logic of like the marketplace. Let's face it, this superficial logic. Should I buy it or not? Tell me. Should I spend my hard-earned money on it or not? Rather than should I think through it in its inexhaustible complexity and risk spending the rest of my life in a unanswerable conundrum that, in which there's never a final answer, but rather a series of profoundly moving different answers? For me, that's the question. I can get into, the reason, shorthand, why he stops calling what he's doing philosophy is he says philosophy is ontotheology. It's always been ontotheology from Thales and Anaximander through Nietzsche, and sometimes he says Marx. When he's in 46, when he thinks he's going to get into some dialogues with the Marxists after the war, when he thinks Russia is going to be the dialogue partner, he gets geared up to talk about Marx, but it doesn't really happen. So, and then he's actually rather unsympathetic toward Marx, and which doesn't mean I am, but he is. And then he does, it's like he stops doing ontotheology, stops doing metaphysics, and thinks metaphysics is a deep and profound part of what's wrong with the world. And he then articulates what he calls thinking, which is this openness to the multiple meaningness of things, which he sees as part of the solution for finding a way beyond the problems that philosophy as metaphysics has gotten us into. And I can say how metaphysics has gotten us into nihilism if you want. That's a big piece of the puzzle. Yeah.
I was going to say, three of the big those master signifiers, in your bio, death, technology, and nihilism. I'm guessing the three of those are all pretty related here.
Yeah, except death is good. For me, I think death is a good thing. So yeah, it's like I defend death. Like I think most people, this is part of my existential side. I think it's Heidegger too. I argue. I've got a rather controversial reading of Heidegger on death, where what I argue is that most people reading Being and Time misunderstand death because they think of what they mean by death when they read Heidegger using the word death. And the problem is that Heidegger did that and isn't very clear about it, but he doesn't mean what we mean by death. He calls that demise. And he distinguishes what he means by death by articulating what it's a kind of profound existential world collapse where, say, what he calls my fundamental for the sake of which, that is like the project that organizes all my other projects, like being a teacher. Let's say that collapses. I get a brain injury or something and I can no longer be a teacher. Well, then all the other projects that sort of propped up that project of being a teacher are going to collapse too. And I'm going to be, it's not like I'm gone. I still exist in the world. I'm just desperately now trying to connect to a world that I can no longer connect to. That's death. Freud would call it mourning. It's like we continue to reach for a world we can no longer step into and understand ourselves in terms of. And then what happens? Well, that's Being in Time calls this authenticity. Authenticity has two sides, the full definition of authenticity. This is the second division of Being in Time, the existential division. Authenticity is defined as anticipatory resoluteness. Anticipatory, that's Vorlaufen, like charging out into. And the image there is like, German soldiers running in, with their gas masks on. Heidegger worked at the meteorological service charting the wind so that the German, it's pre-Nazis, the German army could do gas attacks on the Allies. So they would send these gas attacks in and then they would attack the army across the barricades there, what's called, across the field where they're basically dug into trenches. So you jump out of your trench and run out with your machine gun and the other guys would be choking on the gas and you try and shoot them with your machine guns. Meanwhile, they're blindly shooting their machine guns at you. So it's this image of like running out into death. That's anticipation. So anticipation is this kind of death that you experience in life when you're at an end. Because the other death, demise, the ceasing to live, you don't live through. You don't live through your ceasing to live, as he says in Being in Time. Epicurus realized that a long time ago. Where death is, I am not. Where I am, death is not. Death and I don't ever occupy the same place. I can experience myself dying, but I can't experience myself being dead. So I can't have a phenomenology of being dead if death means demise. But for reasons that I think are somewhat problematic, Heidegger thinks he needs a phenomenology of death. So he articulates a phenomenology of existiert endlich, of existing finitely or at an end, where my existence comes to an end because there's no longer any part of me standing outside myself. As long as I'm a teacher, a father, whatever, a student, there's something for me to do tomorrow. There's something I did yesterday. But when my whole world collapses and I can't be anything, I am now completely transparent to myself. And for methodological reasons, he thinks that's a really important move. This is how Division 2 begins. That's what introduces the discussion of death. So death is this kind of world collapse where then I have to find my way back to the world. So that's resolve or Entschlossenheit, disclosedness. So my world collapses, and then he says in Being in Time, I choose to choose. I decide what self I'm going to be, and I project myself back into the world. Later, by 34, in The Origin of the Work of Art, he says, when I said Entschlossenheit, I didn't mean choose to choose. I meant open yourself to what being is trying to show you. It's not about like what you saying, well, do I want to be an artist or a teacher or a poet or a whatever, a stockbroker? Which self do I want to be? What project do I want to be? It's you opening yourself to the hints that reality is offering to you and creatively deciding which of those hints to disclose. And I would add, though Heidegger underemphasizes this point, this is probably my main criticism of him, and then I take responsibility for how I creatively disclose those hints. I think personal responsibility is something Heidegger is far too quick to erase in his own kind of mystical, quietistic vision of himself as this passive vehicle of providence that's just letting being speak through him, as if he's just taking dictation. But as I say, Heraclitus has this great line. Nature, physis, neither lies nor tells you. I'm simplifying. It merely hints. Meaning the way reality speaks to you is it gives you hints, and it's up to you how you creatively disclose those hints. There's the famous story of the guy goes to the oracle at Delphi and says, will my army win? And she says, a great army will be victorious today. He's like, awesome. And he goes and his army's wiped out. It was the other army that was the great army. So it's up to you how you take those hints. Reality doesn't tell you, go join the Nazis, Heidegger. And hence you've got to take responsibility for the fact that you decided, here's my moment. I've been waiting to try and actually profoundly transform the university. Here's my chance to do it. And, own up to that, which he never. Yeah.
That seems to be a sort of recurring theme for philosophers and intellectuals, is to want to position themselves like Varys from Game of Thrones, or Tyrion, to be the.
Which one? Varys or Tyrion?
I guess it depends on the brand of it. Which one was Heidegger? That's the real question.
Yeah.
Which did he aspire to be?
Definitely wasn't a eunuch.
True.
He's more Tyrion. Yeah. He drank and knew things.
Yeah, true. Maybe Littlefinger. I don't know. I was going to say though, so I've always thought of and kind of heard, or I read death in Being in Time as the possibility of no more possibilities.
Yeah.
Is that good? Yeah.
Possibility of impossibility.
The possibility of impossibility.
It's the possibility of an impossibility. Yeah.
So it's sort of just this. Yeah. Okay. And that haunts us and then informs behavior, right?
But in English, because of the dominance of analytic philosophy, we hear possibilities as like logical or possible moves in a space of options or something. Whereas for Heidegger, possibilities are what William James called live options. They're like what you might press into next, what you could do at the next moment, what you're gonna do. So it's like the possibility of an impossibility is something you embody. It's you embodying that moment when you cannot embody anything. It's not you conceiving of the unconceivable,
Right.
which is something like demise.
Right.
But his analysis of death, as I show in my piece on death and demise in Being and Time, in the Cambridge Companion to Being and Time, his analysis of death is drawn from his analysis of demise. So he's trying to start, like Aristotle, with what we all know about death, at least what we all think we know about death, the formal characteristics of ordinary death, and then articulate the ontological conditions that structure our everyday experience of death, what he calls demise. So for him, ontological death, this world collapse, is what we're really afraid about, to put it simply, about dying. So he does think, I think, that there's a possible profound transformation in our relationship to death, where instead of just running away from it our whole lives, fleeing it, and thereby running ever more quickly toward it, we can confront it, embrace it as part of life, the last part, or as something that's demise, and understand death as something like what we need to repeatedly pass through in order to repeatedly slough off the skin of outdated self-understandings that are holding us back, instead of letting us move on to the next stage in our evolution and the next stage in our, let's say, self-development. So I think Heidegger's view is much more along the lines of like Erik Erikson, or these people who thought of, or Kierkegaard, frankly, the stages on life's way, where life involves passing through a series of stages where you have to die to the old self that you were in order to become the new self that you're on the way to becoming. And that's not something that just happens once. If you're doing it right, it happens again and again and again. And part of that is getting over the terror of that, so that you're not every time desperately clinging to what you were when it's no longer possible. It's not working for you to be that. You got to be able to let it go in order to open yourself to what's coming next.
Well, especially you mentioned Das Man in passing earlier, and it's a very important concept here in relation to authenticity. And I mean, the basic ideas that were thrown into a culture, a language, a way of being, and we imbibe these possibilities that are other people's possibilities before we come to realize what our own most possibilities are, or the kinds of possibilities that are most ours. And I found that bit about the downward cycle of what it is to be at the superficial level of culture, being this one that where it's this process of ambiguity, idle talk, and curiosity. Somehow death is supposed to, like, what, taking a red hand on your death is supposed to be a lifeline out of that.
Yeah, exactly. So think of it this way. Why would you die existentially? Why would your world collapse if you face up to your anxiety? Heidegger thinks if you confront your anxiety, you'll die. Your world will collapse. And why think that? Why think that confronting your anxiety will lead your whole world to collapse? The answer for him is something like, because your world is this piecemeal assemblage that you've just taken over more or less thoughtlessly from everybody else. So like, it's like most people, if they're at all like Heidegger or me, or I think sort of your normal, ordinary, successful person, they're doing what one's supposed to do. Everyone said, oh, you should be a lawyer. You're good at arguing. Go be a lawyer. And then you get to school, and like pretty soon you find yourself in law school. What happens if in my case, I took a law school class before I got to law school and realized I don't want to be a lawyer. Why? The thing I always just assumed I would do, because it was like the background noise of success in my society, is not something that I can see myself doing in a way that would satisfy me. So what do I do now? I did go through a kind of existential world collapse, and having to, open myself to the possibility of what else is in my life that's really calling to me. Philosophy, writing, being a philosopher. This was something that was calling to me, unlike what I always sort of thoughtlessly thought I would do. And I think, today the problem of Das Man, that is of this thoughtless conformism, this kind of ubiquitous norms of propriety, what you must do to be one of us, one of the good guys, is so amplified by social media, and it's gotten down into the micrological details of people's everyday life, that every thought, opinion, taste, you can have is being policed by views about what the correct things to do are. So I think it's like the prison is getting tighter and tighter. So I would think that for anybody who doesn't fit that, what the world is saying you've got to be, the motivations are getting stronger and stronger to break out of that and reject the world of, thoughtless conformity on what we must be, and think for yourself what you want to be and ask those hard questions. What do I want to do with my life? In a way, I think the popularity of Being a Time is, it's a book. The second half of it is a book about that question. It's basically a question of how do you grow up, which is what, college students are usually going through. What do I want to do with my life? This is a book that, granted, at a very abstract level, but for that reason also at a very profound, careful, detailed level, is asking and addressing that question. This kind of, what's it mean to grow up? And the answer is something like, it's not something that happens once and for all. It means to commit yourself to a process of stages in which you're going to keep growing up, right? Breaking out of whatever stage feels like the final stage while you're in it. When you realize, oh, the bachelor life isn't working for me to be married. This married life isn't working for me with my kids, right? The taking care of my kids' life isn't working for me as a career dedicated person. How do I deal with this? These are, I think, the ordinary issues that a lot of us are going through all the time. And Heidegger is providing a framework for addressing them and not giving you answers either, not saying do this, do that. But I think saying it's up to you how you answer that question. No one can tell you. That's the Das Man. Like when you experience existential world collapse and you say, what do I do now? It doesn't help to remember what all your teachers and parents and priests told you should do. That has absolutely no grip on you. It doesn't help. This is actually a big difference between Heidegger and Levinas, because Levinas was one of the first great readers of Heidegger. He understood what Heidegger was saying, unlike most people, realized Heidegger was talking about existential world collapse. And Levinas's view was, what you need when your world collapses is a teacher. That is, you need someone who can show you a path forward. Heidegger's view is much more, in Being a Time, it's much more individualistic. He thinks you've got to choose. Pick yourself up by your own bootstraps. It's up to you to take responsibility for what you're going to do. So, and I've articulated that difference in a series of papers. I think it's not clear to me who's right. I think they're each getting at something important. Some are right some of the time, more right for some people some of the time, et cetera, et cetera. Sometimes you need a teacher.
Well, there is this part, though, where you're all. So I guess I want to make sure that I've got this straight. With Heidegger, there is no possibility. I'm about to ask a question that's being asked in the chat about authenticity, but right before that, with Heidegger, to clarify, there is never you can't ever be fully authentic. It's this sort of constant sort of struggle, but also it's individual in the sense that no one can die for you in your place, but at the same time, taking an authentic stand on your own temporality, that has to do with taking a stand on your own culture and not just the random, whatever's out there being pushed to you by popular culture, right? So there's a sort of authentic collectivity that you can get in touch with for him, which is obviously potentially problematic.
Exactly. Yeah. So he does talk about the possibility of an authentic collective in the chapter on authentic historicality. And that's the chapter that he always pointed to when people said his first PhD student, Carl Löwit, asked him, and I think it was 36. So, long before Heidegger had reason to hide it, he said, Heidegger, there's a big debate whether your Nazism has anything to do with your philosophy. I say it does. Other people say it doesn't. Who's right? And Heidegger said, you're right. It does. It's, look at the chapter on authentic historicality. So Heidegger believed in the possibility of a collective. Basically, in his mind, it was a generation, but you could imagine other collectives, a generation addressing for what the most pressing question for them was. And this is a constant undercurrent in Heidegger's work throughout the 20s. It's something like each generation has to figure out what the pressing tasks that it faces are. What's the challenges that we face as a generation? That's what makes it a generation, is the coming together around whatever it is, the Green New Deal, or electing Trump. God forbid. But, it's got to be, he thought, an issue that brings a whole generation of people together. And if you look at historically, at least in America, what that's meant. I mean, the last time it really happened, I think, was the 60s. And it happened because people were trying not to die, at least not to demise. They didn't want to go to Vietnam. So there was the resistance to the war, fueling into the hippie movement. That was, I think, the last really actual generation. I don't think there's been I think all subsequent generations are just marketing campaigns. There hasn't been like a genuine collective generation since the 60s. So they name them like Generation X, which sounds like Malcolm X and really cool, but it's just like an empty variable placeholder. Or Generation Y, that sounds like We Question, but actually it's not. That was like the generation that all wanted to go work for Wall Street and make a lot of money. And then whatever the current generation is, which actually seems to be a rather philosophical generation. I'm using generation loosely now as like age cohort or something like that. But yeah, it's an interest. So if you could have an authentic generation, there has to be someone who's choosing, who's taking responsibility. And then the question is, that's the question of the leader. So who are the people taking responsibility? And then are the people following them authentic? Doesn't look like it. So it looks like there's some real problems in the concept of an authentic generation, unless you believe, as Heidegger tried to argue in the 30s, for a vision in which everyone would go through this kind of Christian process of like asking the question, do I believe this? And then like explicitly committing themselves to it or not, in order to get a whole generation which every person had explicitly committed. I think that's a kind of holdover of his Christian formation.
It's fascinating. Yeah, and one of the students of Heidegger and critics of Heidegger is Alain Badiou. He's probably like 10 of my favorite philosophers or people I'm most interested in reading studied under Heidegger at some point or have been studying him their entire lives and kind of responding to his project. And Badiou is one of the really interesting ones as a lifelong communist. His idea is that there is a sort of generation you can take an authentic stand on, and its commitment to the cause for an egalitarian, new symbolization. And I talk about that in some of my videos a little bit. But on the question of authenticity, another one of his critics, Theodor Adorno, always comes up as someone who's critiqued him for the rhetoric or the jargon of authenticity. And I'm curious, and actually Michael Downs is in the chat and just asked if you've got thoughts on that.
On Badiou or on the jargon of authenticity, or both?
The jargon, but also I'm super curious to hear about Badiou also.
Yeah. Okay. Well, remind me about the jargon. I don't think much of Adorno's understanding of Heidegger. I mean, Adorno hated Heidegger, and it's a kind of principle of hermeneutics in the analytic and continental worlds. There's a thing called the principle of charity, which is basically, if you want to understand something, you got to assume it makes sense when you're trying to make sense of it. If you're trying to understand it, assuming that it leads to Nazism, you're not going to get a very good understanding of it. So thinking loves, as Heidegger says in 51, one of his great lines. Why did Socrates love hanging out with young men? Because thinking loves. And if you don't love something, you'll never understand it. You can never truly understand something you hate. I can't understand Trump. I just confess it. I mean, I spend a lot of time thinking about Trump, but I've hated him my whole life. The guy calls himself the Donald. That's my middle name, Donald. I was like, how can someone else call themselves the Donald? That's so arrogant. I hated him when he was a Democrat. He just, to me, symbolized this idea that making a lot of money is the meaning of life. That was, by the time I was 10, realized was false, superficial, and idiotic. So, but has convinced a lot of people, and you get a lot of reactionary defenders. So I think if you don't understand, if you don't love something, you don't understand. If you want to like understand what's wrong with some cult, go talk to somebody who was a deep believer in that cult before they left it. Get their view on what was great about it. What was like, because it's very hard to see what's like attractive about some view that you're repulsed by, So, but Badiou, I think is I've had this argument. I teach at a place, as you know, where I've got two colleagues who work on him, Adrian Johnson and Paul Livingston. And so I've been arguing for years that he's very influenced by Heidegger, and they're always kind of skeptical, or they were. They've now, I think, come around. because he denies it. He says all the time that he's against Heidegger, la, la, la. But, you know, all this thinking of the event, that's very obviously Heidegger. And he's building on this Heideggerian thinking of the event, which to me is fascinating. I'm very skeptical of Badiou's, what I think of as like his hyper-rationalist Pythagoreanism, this idea that somehow number discloses the ultimate nature of reality. And if we just understand set theory, it will give us these kind of axiomatic prescriptions that will let us understand politics, how to intervene, what political transformations are, et cetera, et cetera. I think all of that is complete delusion, but I love his vision of the revolution. Like the stuff you were talking about, his most recent book, I think he's no longer even calling himself a communist because he realizes and recognizes that that label is too divisive. It's got too much baggage on it. And that what we need isn't just a revolution against capitalism, right? We need a revolution against like the, what's he call it? The Anthropocene, this vision of human beings as like ruled by a alpha male who owns half the property of the tribe and all the possessions, and everyone else just Das Mann, like the herd follows along behind. We need, as you said, a radical egalitarian politics, and that's a transformation not just against capitalism, but much more deeply against the evolutionary history that's been shaping us for the last 60,000 years. That's his latest book, and I was like, preach, brother. Yeah, no, now you're speaking my language. So I think, you know, that's Heidegger's view of Marx too, is Marx is looking at symptoms and mistaking them for the cause. What the cause is, I think Badiou's a little more on the Nietzschean Darwinian side. Heidegger's on this side that says, you know, that it's not that that view is false, it's just that it's non-exhaustive. There's more to reality than Darwinian evolution can explain. It does, you know, if something can't be explained by Darwin, that doesn't mean it's not real. There's lots of really interesting and significant stuff that we can't explain in evolutionary terms. So, yeah, Badiou, jargon of authenticity.
I will just say that having read it, I think that he's really doing a thing that's, whenever continental philosophers aren't utilizing the principle of charity, I kind of assume that what they're really frustrated about are the Heideggerians or the Derridians that they meet at conferences. Because from my own experience of going to conferences, I get a bad taste in my mouth with certain thinkers that has nothing to do with those thinkers. It has to do with the kind of acolytes they acquire.
Like who can we name names? Who are some of these?
I will not name names, but I will just say that like
are they actual Derridians?
People who say that they've problematized something and then they walk away from it like they did something amazing. Like that's a Derridian move where it's like, look, there was this binary that was assumed. Now I've done something, and it's like you haven't contributed to anything. Everyone already knew that. Or when they're gonna kind of, you know, put Deleuze in there by dropping rhizome, you know, but when it doesn't actually add anything to the discourse, it's like, what are you doing right now?
I feel you. Yeah, no, yeah. I think so. That's where jargon is meaningful. I mean, so jargon is an uncharitable term for the technical terminology of another discourse. So what's like a shorthand in physics is to me a jargon that needs to be explained. If you just start talking in formulas, I won't know what you mean. Or if my analytic friends start talking about, you know, the modal quantification of trans-realist whatever, I want to know like what's each one of those quantifiers, what's each one of those terms mean so that I can evaluate what you're saying. And they're like, well, if I have to slow down and explain everything from the ground up, I can never make my point. I'm trying to make this advanced point by building on all this work that's been done in my community. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate thing to say. So when you're speaking to your community and trying to make some internal advance in it, you're gonna use the jargon. On the other hand, I think part of what's good about being a Heideggerian is because Heidegger was a Nazi, if you're an American Heideggerian, you're not gonna be, I think you're gonna be predisposed away from speaking in a kind of Heideggerese jargon. You're gonna try and translate Heidegger into ordinary English as much as you possibly can, not only to avoid the appearance of just being a brainwashed acolyte, but also because most people that you're talking to, you can't assume they know what Heidegger means by these terms. Even most other people who claim they know Heidegger, it turns out they read it once. They haven't spent their life reading it the way some of us have. So although they say they know it, oh yeah, right. They actually, if you want to have a productive conversation, you've got to kind of drill down on the basic presuppositions. I've had a lot of conversations, even with my colleagues, where after 2 hours, I finally say, oh, so we're just using this one word differently. We weren't disagreeing at all. So we could have figured that out 2 hours ago and saved ourselves this like passionate argument that turned out it was all about nothing. So Heidegger actually says that most discussions are just people talking past each other, and the real disagreements happen at the level of presupposition. So if you want to figure out, do I really disagree with X? Well, I want to, about what? What's the claim? What am I supposed to evaluate here? And I try and explain Heidegger in a way that makes it clear such that people can ask, does that sound right to me? Or, what's really wrong about that? Is that something that describes my own way of looking at the world? Or is that just some backwards, hillbilly, Nazi way of thinking? And I think sometimes it's one, sometimes it's the other. And I try and, part of being a critical Heideggerian is taking Heidegger further. There's this meeting of the Southwest Society for Continental Philosophy just happened. I couldn't go, sadly, but I helped found it like 10, 11 years ago here at New Mexico. And some of my students were there, and one of them was telling me there was a lot of what he called applied Heidegger, which was people using Heideggerian terms, concepts to think about like, where should we go now in queer theory, or in thinking about Hispanic identity, or the issues that confront what's it mean to be a Latinx thinker in the 21st century using Heidegger. And I was like, that's exactly what Heidegger explicitly called for. When the American Heidegger Society organized a meeting on Heidegger, they want him to come talk, and he said, well, I can't, meaning I don't want to go to America, but I can't, but don't make it about Heidegger. Make it about you taking these questions I've raised further for yourselves. Don't get caught up endlessly arguing about what I meant, because that's just scholarship. Do some thinking, try and push the envelope, take history further, see some things that I couldn't see.
We're at the 9 o'clock point, and this is where we're going to wrap it out. But I told you there was that one question, and sure enough, Michael came into the chat and just ask him about being. And
didn't we already explain being? So okay, I'll connect being to queer theory, because it's a nice idea that one of my undergrads was working on and helped me think through it very nicely. So if you think of queerness, I mean, this is slightly controversial, but if you think of queerness as like a category, if you think of it as like LGBTQ, where queer stands for like everything that doesn't fit into the LGBT. Sometimes it's LGBTQ plus, where like the plus is that. But if you think of it as the Q is like what can't easily be fit into one of the other categories, then that's being. So the student of mine wrote a paper on queer Heidegger that was just showing, I think it's very obvious once you see it, that Heidegger's thinking of being is a thinking of this inexhaustible plenitude that can never be finally corralled within some existing framework. So if our sexual being is understood in terms of being, then we're all queer, is the suggestion. And then it gets more provocative, because it means, well, what if I just perfectly fine understand myself in terms of one of the other categories? Does that mean I'm deluded or in false consciousness? I think these are some of the questions that it raises. But the understanding of being, as opposed to, Michael, the understanding of the being of entities, the understanding the being of entities, that is isness, that's just what we think is and matters. And that changes over time. For us right now in our technological age, we think of the being of entities or isness as what Heidegger calls enframing. That's our framework that we understand everything in terms of. It's eternally recurring will to power. He thinks Nietzsche gives us the lenses through which we make sense of reality. And Nietzsche's getting it from Darwin, Adam Smith, and chemistry, basically putting them together as the way of viewing all reality. So we think of all stuff as meaningless stuff just standing by to be optimized as efficiently as possible, including increasingly ourselves. And that view, Heidegger thinks, leads to nihilism. It leads to the view in which nothing has any real weight or significance apart from our own designs and plans. And that view that all value comes from us leads to as Kierkegaard already pointed out, the view that we can take it back. So it leads to this idea that nothing has any significance, nothing endures in its meaningfulness, et cetera, as opposed to the Heideggerian view that what's really enduringly meaningful is an event. And what makes an event enduringly meaningful is that you can't fully understand what it means in the moment. When something profoundly meaningful happens, like a revolution or falling in love or whatever it is, you end up, if you maintain your fidelity to it, to put it in Badiou's terms, if you stay faithful to the ontological disclosure of that event, that means coming to see your life as the creative unfolding of the significance of that event. And that's something that gives identity to your whole life. It gives your life an identity, a worth that emerges in the moment, but even more clearly retrospectively, I think. So you tell yourself the story of yourself as the person who lived that love and unfolded its meaning in all these ways that you didn't even glimpse the first time you saw that person, or the first time you heard the word global warming, or whatever whatever the event was.
Right. So Mike said, so being as such is like the Lacanian real, the excess that always escapes our grasp?
No. So, okay. So good. Lacan translated Heidegger's Anaximander fragment. A lot of Lacanians don't know that. So Lacan's another figure deeply influenced by Heidegger, but I think it's controversial among Lacanians how to understand the real. That's a big mystery for them, but if you understand the real as the ineffable, what you can never grasp, what you can never communicate, then that's Levinas, that's alterity. So Levinas's transformation of Heidegger is to think of what really matters not as ontology, but as alterity, the ineffable. Heidegger's view of being is that being is not alterity, it's not otherness, it's difference, as Derrida said. It's what overflows every concept you have. So it's closer to the Freudian vision of the navel of the dream. That is, in the point in the dream when you can't interpret it. And the reason you can't interpret it is not that you can't figure out what it means, but that it starts meaning everything. That one symbol starts being your mother and your car and your dog and your whatever. It means it all. So being is this seemingly inexhaustible plenitude that we can draw from and point out to other people and they can see it too, but that we can never say, see, and that's it, and draw the line around and say, it's done. No one can add any new meanings to that. We're finished. Because a sufficiently insightful person is going to be able to come along and say, oh, you missed that. Either because you just didn't see it or because you lacked my life experience, perspective. You didn't grow up the way I grew up. You didn't see with the eyes I see. So you don't see this other aspect of being that might in fact be profoundly important or not. It depends, right? It's a deep question.
It sounds like that the excess that always escapes our grasp still, though. I'm not seeing the difference there.
Because it doesn't always escape our grasp. So when you see Van Gogh's painting is a pair of shoes, the one on my cover of Heidegger Art and Postmodernity, yes, it's a painting of a pair of shoes. It's not only a painting of a pair of shoes, but when you grasp it as a painting of a pair of shoes, you're getting something right. But if that's all you see, then you're not seeing what Heidegger saw, which is that this painting also paints all these other possible paintings that you can see if you're sufficiently open to that painting. And hence, for Heidegger, Van Gogh's painting of the shoes is a painting of truth itself as disclosure, as the struggle between earth and world.
Gotcha.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
I have a common misunderstanding of Heidegger that reduces being as such to alterity. I call it the Levinasian misreading, because it basically squishes Heidegger and Levinas together. And I think Heidegger and Levinas are saying different things. Heidegger explicitly said there's no phenomenology of alterity. So for a phenomenologist like him, it's another Dossmannian thing that Heidegger's not a phenomenologist. That's a crazy view, in my opinion. He's clearly a phenomenologist. He does phenomenology throughout his life. The work of art is phenomenology, the poetry is phenomenology, etc. So he's doing phenomenology and more, but he's still doing phenomenology. You can't have a phenomenology of alterity, because what evidence could there be of that which is completely other to anything you can experience? This is part of like the delusion of these speculative realist people who want to like understand reality as it is in itself, apart from all human self-understandings. That's a completely nonsensical, self-undermining concept that they've somehow hoodwinked people into. It's the Dossmann going, what's the next big thing after postmodernism? Oh, is it speculative realism? And they just follow these very, silly and superficial philosophers. It's like continental philosophers trying to do analytic philosophy and doing a terrible job. Did I just alienate your whole audience? Sorry. But yeah, no, I'm not sympathetic. I've heard you all.
I don't want to.
You just spiked the ball, which is a good thing.
That's a hot take. That's a real hot take. It would get you lots of Twitter reactions for sure. But I guess the one thing I wanted to throw in there is that I met Slavoj Žižek last year with Mike at a conference, and one of the things that he talked about for like 10 minutes was the plus sign on LGBTQ plus, and he said something very similar to what you're getting at, and he's like I like this, he really likes the fact that people are thinking about that plusness now, because he's like,
so I had a Lacanian teacher in grad school who was a hardcore Lacanian, who I couldn't understand a damn thing he was saying. I really liked him. He was a super nice guy, and I'm reading Lacan and trying to understand, and it was so difficult. And then I discovered Zizek and loved him precisely because he was doing for Lacan what Dreyfus had done for Heidegger, namely put it into English, giving you examples taken from film and popular culture that explained it. And now I realize that it's an interpretation of Lacan and not the only possible interpretation, but at least it was like, okay, so is that what he's saying? That makes sense to me. And he, I think, was the person, one of the people, Zizek, I think he wrote his dissertation on Heidegger. He realized that being as such was excessiveness, not ineffability. I think he realized that. He at least realized, he argued that Lacanian real was a kind of excessiveness, not an ineffability. I think Zizek kind of goes off the rails with his whole view that where the danger is, the promise is also. He interprets that in terms of I've got to go fall in love with the garbage dump. And like, you remember have you seen the Examine Life movie? It was like looking at like the discarded porno mags and saying, I have to learn to love this if I want to find my way through in framing, which is funny, but not at all Heidegger's view. Heidegger's view is that to find the idea that where the danger is, the saving power also grows. This line from Hölderlin's hymn is that if you understand how our current ontotheology reduces being to nothing, it dissolves being into nothing but becoming, you can come to see that that's how being as such looks from within our current understanding of the being of entities. But that's only how being looks from within metaphysics. And that if you can come to understand being not as nothing at all, but as the nothing of the nothing, that is, as the not yet a thing, hinting about what it could be, that is, offering you hints about all the words you don't have yet, what you might do next with your life, all the sort of significant things that require creative interpretive work to make sense of, then you're beyond metaphysics, beyond this nihilistic age, into this openness to the multiple meanings of things that Heidegger sees as the path into the next age in the world, which he thinks is something like the second day of human history, which is not that far from Badiou's view, that we have to take this big view and say, instead of thinking we humans are done, we've mastered the earth, Heidegger thinks we're little babies. We've had one day on earth. That day is coming to a close. We're in the night of the first day. We're now trying to find a second day, a second way of making sense of ourselves that will help us live meaningful lives. The first one's kind of worn itself out. It's part of what he learned from Nietzsche. So
that, I think, if we could unpack the Heideggerian jargon you finally came out with, both guns blazing, we would have nihilism solved. But I'm not sure.
The nothing of the nothing. Well, so I I addressed that in what is it, chapter 7 of Heidegger Art and Postmodernity. That's this piece I read over in Strasbourg at this International Heidegger conference back in the day. On the danger and the promise of Heidegger, an American perspective. So I encourage anybody interested in that to see. I mean, it was something that it was reading Heidegger, reading Derrida, reading Gadamer, reading Vadimo. All of that helped me figure out what I think Heidegger actually meant by that claim, and I tried to explain it as clearly as I can there. And then I've tried to do it even more succinctly in a piece. There's this forthcoming gigantic scholarly work called the Heidegger Lexicon. It's coming out, I think, in December from Cambridge, edited by my friend and colleague Mark Rathel. And I wrote 2 chapters in there, 2 entries. I did the entries on death and the nothing. So in my entry on the nothing, I try and explain what I just said, that the nothing is not this meaningless metaphysical nonsense the way Carnap took it. It's Heidegger's attempt to articulate what's outside language that language is responding to when it finds new ways to put things into words and show them to other people. It's like the glimmering hints of reality that we're trying to articulate for each other. And he thinks that's what artists do, that's what poets do, and that's what philosophers need to attune themselves to in order to break out a kind of technological monosemic framework and open themselves to a pluralistic view that will be tolerant of everything except intolerance. I've written about the political implications of Heidegger today, and it's a kind of post-metaphysical, post-liberal, tolerant view that refuses, this is what I don't like about some of my communist students, it refuses to conflate the baby of liberal democratic freedoms with the bathwater of capitalist exploitation. It says there's something real and important about the freedoms we've achieved in the West that shouldn't just be thrown out in the vision, in the name of some like new utopian vision of shared human happiness. Because sorry, that's just a new Das Monde saying, here's what you got to do to be happy. All humans need to be this.
Well, just because empire weaponizes the rhetoric of democracy and freedom doesn't mean we throw out democracy and freedom.
Good. Yeah, that's a nice way to put it. I like that. Yeah. So I spend a lot of time arguing with my students about this because, even my students who are very sympathetic to Heidegger are also very sympathetic to Marx. So it's a tricky thing trying to find ways of synthesizing and, I would say in Hegelian terms, sublating Heidegger and Marx that capture what's most insightful about each of them and combine them without sort of falling into the dogmas of either camp. And that's something Derrida tried to do in one of his last books, Spectres of Marx.
Something Arendt spent a long time trying to do also.
Did she? In what book?
As a lifelong project, as a response to Nazism and communism and the failures of both, and liberalism. Right?
I didn't know she grappled with Marxism very much. That's interesting.
She talks some shit. It's kind of like, it's kind of usually in passing. I just read On Violence, and she'll take swings, but her swings are really at Stalinists. They're not really at Marx.
It's a profoundly Heideggerian essay, by the way.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I think about how in order to create something, you've got to destroy something, and
well, she's fleshing out these distinctions between violence and power that are very important. I think violence is necessarily technological. It's an extension of power through other means over others. Not power, force, right? Power is a collective mobilization. So one person can be violent, but one person cannot be powerful because power is a collective mobilization. So the two can work in tandem, but too often violence is actually, it appears when power is lost. That's when the state really brutalizes people, when they realize they're losing power.
Yeah. Let's hope that doesn't happen to us in a year.
Yeah. Anyway, so it's been absolutely fantastic and an honor having you on.
Thanks.
In close.
You know, I just really appreciate that twice you've spoken to our group, and it makes you more than an academic. It makes you a public intellectual, and thanks for doing that.
Sure. Yeah. Were there any? I'll have to go look at the chat and see all the questions I didn't answer, so I can feel my proper existential guilt about it all.
And then you can address those at the beginning in the preamble when we have you back to talk about Derrida and death.
That sounds great.
Fantastic. And that's a to be announced thing, but it's on the books. So
I'll look forward to it.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us. Everyone else, thank you for participating. Have a fantastic night. This will be accessible to everybody for the next few days. It will get unlisted, and then parts of it will get added back for the public. But the whole thing will be available to patrons on in the video form and on podcasts for everybody. So this will be available on podcast apps everywhere within the next month. So thank you, everybody, for joining.
Will you send me the links at some point to this and the last one too? Cool. All
Absolutely.
right. Nice to talk to you.
Yeah, take care. Bye-bye.